The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a scream trapped inside a machine, and the moment I heard it, my coffee cup was already falling from my hand. My name is Daniel Cole, and I was the duty officer at Meridian Outpost, a small human colony sitting on the edge of charted space. My job was simple: watch the sensors, log the traffic, keep the peace between the handful of alien delegations who used our station as a neutral meeting point. Nothing ever happened at Meridian. That was the whole point of Meridian. Until that morning. I ran down the corridor toward the east wing, where the colony school sat behind 3 layers of security glass. My boots hit the floor so hard my ankles ached, but I did not slow down. The corridor lights flickered once, then steadied, and that flicker told me something had touched our power grid from the inside. When I reached the school dome, the door was open. Not broken, not forced. Open, like someone had simply asked it to move aside, and it obeyed. I stepped inside, and the silence hit me harder than any sound could have. 31 children were supposed to be sitting at their little round tables at this hour, drawing pictures of planets they had never visited, arguing over crayons, laughing at nothing the way children do. Instead, there were only empty chairs. A single toy robot lay on its side on the floor, its small wheels still spinning, clicking softly against the tile like a clock counting down to nothing. I crouched down and touched it. The metal was warm. Whatever happened here, it happened only minutes ago. I checked the walls. No damage. I checked the windows. Sealed from the outside, untouched. I checked the security terminal, and my stomach turned to ice when I saw the readout. Every camera in the school had recorded a smooth, unbroken feed, right up until the exact second the children disappeared, and then it simply continued, as if nothing at all had happened in between. No error, no gap, no struggle. That should not have been possible. Our systems were built to catch anything larger than a small animal moving through restricted space. Whoever did this did not sneak past our sensors. They walked through them like they were not even there. I keyed my comm unit, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, though my hands were shaking. Control, this is Cole. I need every officer on this station at the school dome right now. We have a missing person situation. Repeat, all officers, school dome, immediately. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. Copy, Cole, on our way. I did not tell them how many were missing. I could not make myself say the number yet. Saying 31 children made it real in a way that even standing in that empty room had not. Other staff members arrived within minutes, and I watched their faces change one by one as they understood what they were looking at. A young teacher named Grace Whitmore stood frozen in the doorway, both hands pressed over her mouth. She had walked these same children in from the courtyard less than an hour earlier. She had counted them at the door, the way she always did. I need the full roster, I told her gently. Names, ages, everyone who should be inside this room right now. She nodded, unable to speak, and pulled up the attendance log on her tablet with trembling fingers. While she worked, I walked the perimeter of the dome one more time, searching for anything I might have missed. That was when I found it, tucked into the corner near the ventilation grate. A thin, dark residue, almost like scorched dust, but with a faint metallic shimmer that caught the light strangely when I tilted my head. I had never seen anything like it in any of our supply manuals or hazard guides. I sealed a sample into a container and sent it straight to the lab, along with a priority flag that would wake up every technician on shift. By the time I returned to the control room, the station commander had already been notified. Her name was Laura Whitfield, a steady woman who had served on 3 different colonies before Meridian and had never once raised her voice in the 2 years I had worked under her. When I walked in, she was standing at the main console, staring at the sensor logs with an expression I had never seen on her before. "Talk to me, Daniel," she said quietly. I gave her everything. The open door with no forced entry, the seamless camera feed, the strange residue near the vents, the complete absence of any struggle, any alarm trigger, any sign that 31 children had been taken from a secured facility in broad daylight. She listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening more with every detail. "Whoever did this either has technology far beyond anything we have on record," I said, "or they had help from inside this station." Laura closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, and I saw something behind them that I can only describe as controlled fear. Not panic, fear that had already decided what it was going to do about itself. "Get me a secure line to Fleet Command," she said. "And Daniel, I want you patched in too. You found this. You are staying on it." I nodded, though my throat felt tight. The connection took less than a minute, which told me something on its own, because secure lines to Fleet Command usually took much longer to establish. The moment the channel opened, I understood why. There was already a small crowd of senior officers waiting on the other end, as if they had been expecting a call like this one for a long time and had simply been waiting to find out from where it would come. A stern-faced officer with silver hair leaned toward the camera. I did not recognize her rank insignia at first, and when I did, my chest tightened, because it was far higher than anything I usually reported to. "Commander Whitfield," she said, "report." Laura gave the summary in a clear, steady voice, though I could hear the effort behind every word. 31 children, ages 5 to 11, taken from a secured school facility, with no sign of forced entry, no camera evidence of the event itself, and an unidentified residue left at the scene. The room on the other end went utterly still. I watched the silver-haired officer's face carefully, and for a heartbeat, something crossed it that unsettled me more than anything I had seen in that empty classroom. It was recognition, not confusion, not disbelief. Recognition, as if she had been dreading this exact message arriving one day, and now that it finally had, some private fear inside her had just been confirmed. She turned away from the camera and spoke quietly to someone off-screen, too low for the microphone to catch clearly, though I caught fragments. Words like containment protocol and full escalation, and one phrase that made the hair on my arms stand up. They actually did it. When she turned back to us, her expression had hardened into something almost unreadable. "Commander Whitfield," she said, "effective immediately, Meridian Outpost is placed under joint security lockdown. No unauthorized vessels in or out. I am dispatching an investigative team, and I want every scrap of physical evidence preserved exactly as it is. Do not clean that residue. Do not disturb that room." "Understood," Laura said. "Ma'am, can you tell us what we are dealing with?" The officer hesitated, and in that hesitation, I felt the floor tilt beneath me, even though I had not moved an inch. "Not yet," she said, "but I promise you this. If what I suspect is true, this station just became the center of something far larger than a missing persons case. Hold your position, Commander. Help is already on the way, and it is coming faster than protocol would normally allow." The channel closed, and the control room fell into a silence so heavy I could hear the ventilation system humming overhead, the same gentle hum that had been running in the school dome minutes before 31 children vanished from a room with no way out. I stood there staring at the blank screen, turning the officer's reaction over and over in my mind. She had not looked surprised that children could be taken from a heavily protected human colony. She had looked like a woman who had just learned that a threat she believed was still theoretical had finally become real. Laura placed a hand on my shoulder, and I realized I had been standing rigid for almost a full minute without moving. "Daniel," she said softly, "whatever this turns out to be, we are going to get those children back." I wanted to believe her completely, and some part of me did, but another part of me, the part that had just watched a senior fleet officer's composure crack for half a second before she caught herself, understood that we had just stepped into something much bigger than a rescue mission. I looked back toward the corridor that led to the school dome, toward that small toy robot still lying on its side, wheels finally still now, and I made myself a quiet promise, standing right there in the control room. Whoever had walked through our defenses like they were nothing was about to learn exactly what it meant to take something from us that we would never, Under any circumstance, let go. Outside the station windows, the stars looked exactly the same as they had every other night I had stood watch at Meridian. Calm, distant, indifferent to everything happening below them. I had a feeling that was about to change. The investigative team arrived faster than any transport I had ever seen move through open space, and when the doors of their shuttle opened, I understood why Laura had looked so unsettled during that call. This was not a small crew sent to ask a few questions. This was a full task force, and standing among the human officers were 3 alien representatives, each wearing the insignia of species, who rarely set foot on human colonies at all. I was ordered to assist the lead investigator, a calm, methodical man named Ethan Marsh, who carried himself like someone who had seen more strange things in his career than he ever talked about. He walked into the school dome, studied the scorch marks near the vent, examined the sealed sample container, and did not say a single word for almost 5 full minutes. Then he looked at me and asked a question I was not expecting. "Has anyone told the Alliance liaisons yet?" I shook my head. "Not that I know of." He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something for him. "Then we need to, because if my instincts are right, this is not the first time this has happened. It is just the first time it happened to us." Within the hour, I found myself in a briefing room crowded with more alien representatives than I had ever seen gathered in one place outside of formal treaty ceremonies. There was a tall, elegant being from the Korvathi assembly, whose species communicated mostly through subtle changes in skin color, and a broad-shouldered representative from the Dinar coalition, who kept glancing toward the door as though expecting an attack at any moment. Both of them looked deeply uncomfortable, but neither looked as uncomfortable as the third guest, a smaller alien wearing the neutral gray robes of an independent observer named Solon Iron. Ethan stood at the front of the room and laid out everything we knew: the missing children, the seamless camera feed. The unidentified residue, which the lab had now confirmed contained trace elements not found anywhere in the standard registry of known alien technologies. When he finished, the Korvathi representative spoke first, her voice calm but her skin shifting to a pale, uncertain color that I had learned meant discomfort. "This is troubling," she said, "but I must ask, why has your fleet already begun repositioning ships along 3 separate border corridors? Our monitoring stations detected the movement less than an hour after your first report. That is an extraordinary response to a single missing persons case, even one this disturbing." I glanced at Ethan, curious myself, since I had not been briefed on any fleet movements. He did not look surprised by the question at all. "Because for us," he said quietly, "this is not simply a missing persons case. It touches something our species does not treat the way other species may expect." The Dinar representative folded his thick arms. "Explain." Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "Every species in this room has its own doctrines, rules that are written down, debated, voted on, revised. But humanity carries one rule that was never voted on, because it never needed to be. It exists beneath our laws, beneath our politics, beneath everything else we argue about among ourselves. When our children are threatened, that rule activates before any committee can even convene to discuss it." Solon Iron, the quiet observer, leaned forward slightly. "Are you saying your leadership does not require formal authorization to respond with force?" "I am saying," Ethan replied, "that by the time formal authorization would normally be granted, our forces are usually already moving. Command exists to guide that response, not to permit it. This is something few outside species have understood about us, because we have simply never needed to demonstrate it before now." The room went quiet. I could see the Korvathi representative's color shifting through several shades, settling finally on something close to alarm. I did not fully understand the weight of what Ethan was describing until later that day, when I was pulled into a smaller meeting with Laura and 2 fleet analysts who had been tracing the strange residue found near the vents. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman named Nora Ellison, pulled up a molecular breakdown on the main screen. "This composition matches something we have only seen twice before," she said. both times in classified incident reports involving a faction operating under the banner of the Veil Dominion. I frowned. I have heard of the Veil. They are part of the wider alliance structure, aren't they? Trade partners, mostly. The main Dominion government, yes, Nora said. But there is a rogue faction operating within their fringe territories, one the official Veil government has quietly disavowed for years without ever fully shutting it down. This faction believes that species without advanced interstellar technology, including humanity until fairly recently, do not carry the same moral weight as species who do. They have used that belief to justify research programs on juveniles of what they consider lesser species. My stomach turned over completely. Research programs. Nora did not soften the words. That is the term used in the classified reports. I am sorry, Daniel. I know that is difficult to hear. I thought of the small toy robot lying on its side in that empty classroom, wheels still spinning, and I felt something inside me shift from fear into a colder, steadier kind of resolve. Laura must have seen it on my face, because she stepped closer and spoke in a low voice meant only for me. I need you level-headed right now, Daniel, not consumed by anger. Anger gets people killed. Focus gets children brought home. She was right, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, to let the cold clarity settle instead of the heat. Over the following hours, more pieces came together. Fleet analysts traced faint energy signatures leaving our system in the minutes surrounding the abduction, signatures that matched known Veil faction transport signatures almost exactly. Ethan's investigative team compared our scene to two other unsolved incidents from years earlier, both involving isolated human settlements on the edges of colonized space, both previously written off as unexplained disappearances due to a total lack of evidence. This was not unexplained anymore. I sat in on the strategy briefing that followed, held in a reinforced conference room deep within the station, where Laura, Ethan, and several fleet officers I did not recognize studied a star map covered in projected routes and probability markers. If the pattern holds, one officer said, they are moving the children toward a facility somewhere near the outer Veil fringe territories, likely disguised as an agricultural or research outpost to avoid drawing Alliance attention. How confident are we in that assessment? Laura asked. Confident enough that Fleet Command has already authorized full mobilization pending final location confirmation, the officer replied. This is no longer a rescue operation planning session, Commander. This is a staging session. I felt my pulse quicken at those words. Full mobilization. I had grown up hearing stories about humanity's early conflicts among the stars, distant history lessons about a species that had entered the wider galactic community as the newest, smallest, least technologically advanced member of the table. I had always pictured us as guests at someone else's gathering, careful, polite, grateful simply to have a seat. I had never once imagined what it would look like when that same quiet, careful species decided that a line had finally been crossed. Later that evening, I found Ethan alone in the observation deck, staring out at the stars the same way I had earlier that day, though his expression carried none of my earlier uncertainty. His was calm, focused, almost patient, like a man watching weather roll in that he had been expecting for a long time. "Can I ask you something?" I said, stepping up beside him. "Of course. Earlier, in the briefing, you said this rule of ours activates before committees can even discuss it. How does that actually work? I have never seen it happen before." Ethan was quiet for a moment before answering. "Most people never do, because most people never need to. It only becomes visible under exactly these circumstances. And once it becomes visible, Daniel, it does not stay quiet for long." As if his words had summoned it, my comm unit buzzed against my wrist. I looked down and read the message twice before I fully absorbed it. Location confirmed. Departure in 6 hours. All available personnel report for briefing. I looked back out at the stars, and for the first time since that alarm had torn through the silence of an ordinary morning, I did not feel fear rising in my chest. I felt something steadier take its place, something that felt almost like the calm before a wave finally breaks after building for a very long time. 6 hours, I said quietly. Ethan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the stars ahead of us, stars that were about to carry an entire fleet toward a facility that had made a terrible mistake without understanding what it had truly provoked. 6 hours, he repeated. Then we go get them. The 6 hours passed faster than I expected, and yet somehow slower than I could bear. I spent most of it in the equipment bay, being fitted for gear I had only ever trained with in simulations, never in anything real. A quiet technician named Owen Bishop checked the seals on my suit twice. Then a third time, his hand steady even though I could see the tension in his jaw. "You are cleared for the boarding element," he told me. "Stay close to your squad lead. Do exactly what she says, when she says it." I nodded, my mouth too dry to answer properly. When I finally stepped aboard the transport ship, I understood for the first time just how large this operation truly was. I had expected a handful of vessels, maybe a strike team of a few dozen soldiers. What I found instead was staggering. Rows of transport ships stretched across the docking bay farther than I could see, and beyond the viewports I could make out the dark shapes of carriers and escort vessels forming up in formation, more firepower gathered in one place than I had known our fleet even possessed. I found Laura standing near the loading ramp, watching the same scene with an expression somewhere between pride and quiet dread. "I did not know we had this many ships," I admitted. "Neither did most people outside Fleet Command," she said. "A lot of this has been sitting in reserve for years, maintained but never activated. Nobody wanted to explain why we kept it ready. Now I suppose we do not have to explain anything at all." I thought about what Ethan had told me on the observation deck, about a rule that existed beneath our laws and our politics, one that had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Standing in that docking bay, surrounded by more warships than I had ever imagined humanity building, I finally understood the scale of what he had meant. What surprised me most, though, was not the size of the fleet, it was the people filling it. As we boarded, I noticed how many of the soldiers around me were not career military at all. A woman named Chloe Bennett had been a schoolteacher before volunteering the moment word spread through her colony. A broad-shouldered man named Marcus Doyle had left his position running cargo routes between outposts, saying only that his youngest niece was the same age as some of the missing children. I met a retired engineer named Henry Auld, who had come out of retirement within hours of hearing the news, insisting his decades of technical experience were more useful in an active operation than sitting quietly at home. Recruitment stations across every human colony had been overwhelmed within hours, Laura told me quietly as we settled into our seats. Fleet Command had to turn away volunteers by the thousands, not because we didn't need the numbers, but because we needed people who could move quickly and precisely, not simply people who were willing. I looked around the transport at the rows of quiet, focused faces, and I realized something that settled deep into my chest. This was not simply an army following orders. This was an entire species responding to a threat against its youngest members, a response that had assembled itself faster than any bureaucracy could have organized on its own. Sitting near the front of our section was Solon Erin, the small gray-robed observer who had questioned Ethan so carefully during our first briefing. I had not expected to see any alien representatives on this transport at all, and my confusion must have shown on my face, because Solon offered a small, tired smile. "I requested to accompany this mission," Solon explained when I noticed my expression. My superiors believed it wise to have an independent witness present, given how unusual this response has been considered by outside observers. "Are you frightened?" I asked, before I could stop myself. Solon considered the question seriously. "I have observed many species prepare for conflict throughout my career," Solon said. "Most carry visible anger, or visible excitement, or visible fear. Your people carry something else, a kind of stillness. It is, I confess, more unsettling than any of the others." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded and looked back out the viewport as the massive docking bay doors began to open. The journey toward Vale Fringe territory took several tense hours, hours filled with quiet checks of equipment, quiet reviews of the facility layout our analysts had pieced together from intercepted transmissions, and quiet conversations between soldiers who mostly kept their thoughts to themselves. I noticed Chloe Bennett sitting with a small photograph in her hands, and though I could not see clearly what it showed, I understood without asking. Laura moved through the transport methodically, checking in with every squad, offering steady reassurance without ever promising anything she could not guarantee. When she reached our section, she crouched down beside my seat. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Steady," I said, and found that it was mostly true. "Good," she said, "because in a few hours, you are going to need every bit of that steadiness." As we approached the outer edge of Vale Fringe space, our fleet slowed to avoid triggering any long-range detection grids the facility might have in place. Ethan's investigative team had spent the intervening hours refining their assessment of the facility's defenses, and the picture that emerged was troubling in its own way. The Vale faction had clearly not expected anyone to trace them this quickly, or this precisely. Their perimeter systems were adequate for deterring casual intrusion, but nowhere near sufficient to stop a coordinated fleet that already knew exactly where to strike and exactly how to avoid triggering broader alarms across their sensor network. They believed their location was hidden, Ethan explained during our final briefing, his voice calm despite the gravity of what he was describing. They did not believe anyone could trace faint departure signatures across multiple systems and cross-reference them against two older unsolved incidents. That confidence is going to cost them any real chance at defending this facility properly. I studied the schematic displayed on the main screen, a converted agricultural outpost that our analysts believed had been repurposed years earlier into something far darker beneath its unassuming surface. Most of its structure sat below ground, hidden beneath fields that from orbit would look like nothing more than ordinary farmland. Our approach plan was precise. A small advance team would disable the facility's outer sensor grid without triggering any alarms, allowing the main strike element to move in close before anyone inside understood what was happening. Once the main force secured the perimeter, boarding teams like mine would move directly toward the lower levels, where intercepted transmissions suggested the detention areas were located. Precision matters more than speed here, Laura reminded the assembled soldiers during the final briefing. We are not here to destroy this facility. We are here to secure 31 children and bring them home safely. Every decision from this point forward gets measured against that single goal. I appreciated that reminder more than I could express. Somewhere beneath the cold focus that had settled over me since departure, a part of me had been afraid that once the fighting started, everything might become chaos, and in chaos, children could easily be caught in the crossfire. Hearing Laura state the priority so clearly steadied something inside me that had been quietly unraveling since we left Meridian. As our transport approached final release position, I checked my equipment one last time, running through the same steps Owen had taught me back in the equipment bay. Around me, other soldiers did the same, the quiet clicks and adjustments filling the cabin with a steady, rhythmic sound that almost resembled a heartbeat. Solon Irin sat quietly beside me, watching everything with careful, curious eyes. "May I ask you something before we arrive?" Solon said. "Go ahead. If this facility offers no resistance, if they simply surrender the children the moment your forces arrive, would you still consider this operation a victory?" I thought about the question seriously before answering. "Yes," I said. "Getting them home safely is the only victory that matters. Everything else is just the path we had to take to get there." Solon nodded slowly, something in that small gesture suggesting the answer had told them more about humanity than any briefing document ever could. A moment later, the transport shuddered gently as it detached from the main formation, joining the smaller flight of boarding craft descending toward the atmosphere below. Through the viewport, I could see the dark shape of the facility coming into view, its unassuming farmland exterior doing nothing to hide the tension building in my chest. 30 seconds to breach point, the pilot announced over the comm. I gripped my equipment tighter, thought briefly of the small toy robot lying on its side in an empty classroom, and let that image settle the last of my nerves into something hard and focused. We were close now, and whatever waited for us inside that facility was about to learn exactly what it meant to have made an enemy of an entire species. The advance team disabled the outer sensor grid exactly as planned, and our boarding craft touched down in near total silence along the far edge of the field surrounding the facility. I stepped out into cool, open air that smelled faintly of turned soil, an unsettling contrast to the tension coiled tight in my chest. Laura moved at the front of our squad, her weapon lowered but ready, her steps quick and certain across the uneven ground. I followed close behind, with Chloe Bennett and Marcus Doyle flanking either side, and Solon Iron trailing a short distance back, observing everything with quiet, careful attention. The perimeter guards stationed around the facility's hidden entrance were caught completely unprepared, and our forces secured them without incident within the first few minutes. No alarms sounded, no resistance materialized. It seemed the facility's leadership genuinely believed their location remained undiscovered, right up until the moment our teams began moving through their outer corridors. We found the entrance to the lower levels exactly where our analysts had predicted, a reinforced doorway disguised behind rows of storage equipment. Ethan's investigative team had provided detailed schematics gathered from intercepted transmissions, and Laura consulted them briefly before signaling our squad forward. "Detention level should be 3 floors down," she said quietly. "Stay tight, stay quiet. Let the forward scouts clear each junction before we move through it." We descended in careful, measured steps, passing sterile corridors lined with equipment I did not recognize and did not want to understand. My chest tightened with every level we descended, the weight of what we might find growing heavier with each passing minute. When we finally reached the detention level, I had to stop myself from rushing forward the moment I saw it. Rows of small holding rooms lined the corridor, each sealed behind reinforced glass, and behind that glass, I could see them. Children, seated on simple cots, some huddled together for comfort, others staring blankly at nothing, all of them clearly frightened but, as far as I could tell in that first desperate glance, unharmed. I felt something crack open in my chest, relief and fury tangled together so tightly I could not separate one feeling from the other. Laura's voice cut through my racing thoughts, calm and steady despite everything. "Secure the level, get those doors open, gently, quickly, but gently." Our team moved with practiced precision, and within minutes, the reinforced doors began sliding open one by one. I will never forget the sound that filled that corridor next, the sound of 31 children realizing, almost all at once, that the people standing before them were not their captors. A small girl near the front, no older than 6, looked up at me with wide, uncertain eyes, and I crouched down slowly, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage. "You are safe now," I told her. "We are here to take you home." Her lower lip trembled, and then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, and I felt my resolve nearly break completely for the first time since that alarm had first sounded back at Meridian. That was when the alert came through my comm unit, sharp and urgent. "Facility commander located. Central control room, 1 level up. He is refusing to surrender access to the remaining secured areas." Laura's expression hardened instantly. "Cole, Bennett, with me. Doyle, keep securing this level and start moving the children toward the extraction point." I gently released the small girl into the care of another soldier, promising her I would be back soon, and followed Laura and Chloe up toward the central control room, my earlier relief hardening back into focused determination. The control room door had been sealed from the inside, but our breaching team made short work of it, and when it finally slid open, I found myself face to face with the being responsible for everything that had happened over the past several days. He was tall, with pale gray skin and sharp angular features, dressed in the formal uniform of a Vale faction commander. His name, I would later learn, was Threll Vasarin, and in that first moment, he did not look afraid at all. He looked almost offended, as though our presence in his facility was some kind of grave misunderstanding, rather than the direct consequence of his own actions. "You have made a significant error," he said, his translated voice carrying an edge of cold authority. "This facility operates under independent scientific authority, beyond the reach of Standard Alliance jurisdiction. Your unauthorized incursion will have serious diplomatic consequences." I felt anger rise sharply in my chest, but I forced myself to stay silent, letting Laura take the lead. "You abducted 31 children from a protected human colony," Laura said, her voice flat and controlled, in a way that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. "There is no diplomatic framework in this galaxy that protects you from what you have done." Threll's expression shifted, a thin, condescending smile crossing his sharp features. "You misunderstand the nature of our work, Commander. These children were never harmed. They were studied, observed. Your species remains largely uncatalogued in terms of developmental biology, and the scientific value of that information far outweighs whatever discomfort your colony has experienced. Lesser species have long served this purpose for those further along the path of advancement. I assumed humanity, being relatively new to interstellar community, would eventually come to accept this reality, however unpleasant it currently seems to you." I watched Laura's jaw tighten, but her voice remained level. "You assumed wrong," she said simply. Threll's smile faltered slightly, though his posture remained rigid, defiant. "You believe your small strike force changes the fundamental power dynamics at play here. Even if you extract every child from this facility today, the Veiled Dominion possesses resources and standing within the Alliance that your young species cannot begin to match. This incursion will be remembered as an act of reckless aggression, not heroism." That was when I stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "You still do not understand what you have actually done," I said. Threll turned his sharp gaze toward me, clearly unimpressed. "Enlighten me then, human." I held his gaze steadily. "You are looking at 3 of us, standing in your control room, having already secured every level of this facility, without triggering a single alarm your systems were designed to detect. Outside, in orbit above this planet, there is a fleet larger than anything your faction has ever encountered, mobilized and in position within hours of us discovering what you had done. Every soldier on that fleet volunteered the moment they heard children had been taken, not because a committee ordered them to, not because a treaty required it, because that is simply what happens when someone threatens what we protect most fiercely." Threll's confident expression began to waver for the first time since we had entered the room. I continued, my voice steady despite the anger still burning beneath it. "You called us a lesser species. You assumed a species without your level of advancement would not understand the value of what you took, or would lack the capability to respond effectively. What you failed to understand is that our value system was never built around technological advancement in the first place. It was built around protecting our children, absolutely and without exception, and that principle does not weaken simply because we lack certain capabilities you consider superior." I stepped closer, and I saw something shift behind Threll's eyes, something that had not been there moments before. "Right now," I said quietly, "every remaining member of your faction is being secured across this facility. Every research file documenting what you have done to those children, and likely children from other species before them, is being copied for permanent record. Every ship capable of leaving this planet's orbit has already been disabled by our forces above. There is no diplomatic argument remaining that protects you from what happens next, because what happens next has already been decided the moment you chose to take something that was never yours to take." Threll took an involuntary step backward, his composed authority finally cracking apart completely. I watched real fear settle into his sharp features for the first time, his earlier condescension replaced by something far more honest. "You kidnapped human children," I said, my voice quiet but absolutely certain. "Did you truly believe there would be no consequences waiting for you at the end of that decision?" For a long moment, Threll said nothing at all, his gaze darting between Laura, Chloe, and me, as though searching desperately for some argument that might still save him. He found none. I did not fully understand, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper now, all trace of his earlier arrogance completely gone. I did not understand what your species truly values, until this very moment. Laura stepped forward, her weapon still lowered, but her presence commanding every bit of authority in that room. Then let this be the moment every faction like yours finally learns it, she said. Threll Viserion, you are being taken into custody, along with every member of your staff, and every piece of evidence documenting what has happened inside this facility. You will answer for this, not through violence, but through a process that will show the entire galaxy exactly what kind of restraint humanity is capable of, even when facing something as unforgivable as what you have done. I watched the last of Threll's defiance crumble away completely as our security team moved in to secure him, and for the first time since that alarm had torn through the silence back at Meridian, I felt something close to peace settle into my chest. We had found them, we had gotten them back, and somewhere behind us, 31 children were finally being led safely toward the surface, toward transport ships waiting to carry them home. The mission was not over yet. But the hardest part, the part I had feared most since that first terrible silence in an empty classroom, was finally, completely behind us. The walk back up through the facility felt entirely different from the descent that had brought us there. Where before every corridor had carried tension thick enough to choke on, now there was something lighter moving through the air, a fragile but growing sense of relief that seemed to spread through every soldier we passed. By the time we reached the surface, the extraction point had become a carefully organized scene of quiet activity. Medical staff moved between groups of children, checking them gently, offering warm blankets and soft words of reassurance. I spotted the small girl who had hugged me earlier, now wrapped snugly in a blanket, sitting beside another child and pointing up at the transport ships descending toward the field, her earlier fear replaced by wide-eyed curiosity. Chloe Bennett knelt beside a small boy who would not stop shaking, speaking to him in the same patient, steady voice I imagined she had once used with her students back home. Marcus Doyle carried a sleeping child in his arms toward the nearest medical transport, his earlier restless energy settled into careful, protective focus. Laura moved through the extraction site methodically, checking with each squad, confirming head counts, making certain every single child was accounted for before allowing herself even a moment to exhale. 31, she confirmed quietly, reading from the final tally on her tablet. All 31 accounted for and confirmed unharmed by medical staff. I felt the last of the tension drain from my shoulders at those words, a weight I had been carrying since that very first alarm finally lifting away completely. Behind us, security teams continued moving through the facility, cataloging research files, securing remaining staff members, and preparing the entire site for a full Alliance investigation that would begin the moment jurisdiction could be properly established. Ethan Marsh oversaw much of that process personally, ensuring every piece of evidence was preserved exactly as protocol required, nothing rushed, nothing overlooked. Solon Iron found me near the edge of the extraction site, watching the transport ships lift off one by one, each carrying a group of children safely back toward the waiting fleet above. I have observed many operations throughout my career, Solon said quietly, standing beside me. I have never witnessed one conducted with this particular combination of speed and restraint. Your commander could have ordered far greater force used against this facility. She did not. Getting them home safely was always the goal, I said. Everything else was just how we got there. Solon considered that for a long moment. I believe my superiors will need to substantially revise their understanding of your species, they finally said. What I witnessed here today will not be easily forgotten. Neither will what was done to those children, I replied quietly. I hope your government understands that as clearly as we do. Solon nodded slowly and said nothing further, though I sensed the weight of that silence carried more meaning than words could have offered. The journey back to Meridian passed in a blur of exhausted relief. I spent much of it seated near a group of children who had gradually begun to relax, some even managing small, tentative smiles as medical staff reassured worried families through secure video connections established the moment the fleet cleared Vale territory. I watched parents weep with relief on small screens throughout the transport, and I understood, more clearly than ever, exactly why an entire species had mobilized so completely, so quickly, the moment word had spread of what happened. When we finally arrived back at Meridian, the scene waiting for us at the docking bay was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Families crowded every available space, pressed against barriers, straining for a glimpse of the children finally returning home. The moment the first group stepped off the transport ramp, the noise that erupted through that docking bay was unlike anything I had ever heard. Relief and joy tangled together so completely it brought tears to my eyes despite every effort to stay composed. I watched Grace Whitmore, the young teacher who had stood frozen in the school dome doorway days earlier, rush forward and gather several of her students into her arms at once, sobbing openly with relief. I watched Laura step back and simply observe the reunions unfolding before her, a small, exhausted smile finally breaking through the composed exterior she had maintained throughout the entire operation. In the weeks that followed, the diplomatic fallout unfolded exactly as Laura had promised it would. Evidence gathered from the facility was presented before a full Alliance tribunal, and the scope of what investigators uncovered extended far beyond the 31 children taken from Meridian. Records revealed similar incidents stretching back years, involving juveniles from at least 4 other species, each case previously dismissed or quietly buried by a Vale Dominion government, unwilling to fully confront what its fringe faction had been doing under the guise of scientific research. Threll Viserion stood before that tribunal, alongside several senior members of his faction, and I watched the proceedings from Meridian through a secure broadcast feed, alongside Laura, Ethan, and many others who had taken part in the rescue. Threll's earlier arrogance never fully returned, replaced instead by the same hollow, defeated expression I had witnessed in that control room, the moment he finally understood exactly what he had provoked. The tribunal's ruling sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles across the Alliance, not simply because of the severity of the consequences handed down to Threll and his faction, though those consequences were significant, but because of how thoroughly humanity's response to the entire crisis was documented and studied by observers from dozens of other species. Solon Irin's own detailed account of the rescue operation became required reading at several diplomatic academies within months, cited repeatedly as a case study in what one instructor later described, during a recorded lecture I happened to watch, as calculated restraint paired with absolute resolve. I found myself thinking often about something Ethan had told me back on that observation deck, in the quiet hours before our fleet departed for Vale territory. He had said that most species never witnessed the rule humanity carried beneath its laws and its politics, because most species never needed to see it. I understood now, more completely than I ever had before, exactly what he meant. That rule had always existed, quiet and unspoken, waiting patiently beneath the surface of everything else that defined us as a species. It had simply been waiting for the moment it would finally be tested. Meridian Outpost slowly returned to something resembling its old rhythm in the months that followed, though nothing about it ever felt quite the same as before. The school dome reopened eventually, its security systems significantly upgraded, though I noticed the children who had been taken often glanced toward the doors a little more carefully than they once had, a small, understandable habit that I suspected would take considerable time to fade completely. I visited the school one final time before requesting a transfer to a new assignment, one that would take me further out toward the frontier, closer to where I felt I could make the most difference in ensuring nothing like this ever happened again. Grace Whitmore greeted me warmly at the door, gesturing toward a small display near the entrance that had not been there before, a simple plaque listing the names of every child who had been taken and safely returned. "We wanted something that reminded everyone what was protected here," she explained, "and what it cost to make certain it stayed protected." I studied the names carefully, remembering each face I had carried out of that facility, each small hand I had helped lead back toward the light after days spent in darkness, they should never have had to endure. As I turned to leave, the small girl who had hugged me on that first terrible day inside the detention level came running up the corridor, her earlier fear entirely gone, replaced now by the bright, unguarded energy that belonged to children who finally felt safe again. "Are you leaving?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. "For now," I told her, crouching down to her level. "But I promise you, wherever I go next, I am going to make sure nothing like what happened to you ever happens again, to anyone." She considered that seriously for a moment, then smiled and wrapped her arms around my shoulders one final time, the same way she had in that facility corridor, though this time the embrace carried nothing but simple, uncomplicated gratitude. I stood outside the school dome for a long moment after she ran back inside, looking up at the sky above Meridian, calm and steady the way it always had been, the way it always would be, protected now by an understanding that had rippled outward across the entire galaxy. Humanity had entered the wider interstellar community as its newest, smallest member, careful and quiet among older, more established species. But in the days following that terrible morning at Meridian, something fundamental had shifted in how every other species understood exactly what that quiet carefulness had always concealed beneath its surface. We had shown the galaxy precisely what happened when someone threatened what we protected most fiercely, and I had a feeling that lesson, once learned, would never need to be taught again.